Awesome. Great. So recording's underway and we've given it a couple of minutes, a couple more maybe filtering through. So welcome everybody to the August 2023 INCOSE New Zealand meetup for the New Zealand chapter of INCOSE. Broad overview. We'll go through some general business, chapter related things, New Zealand specific training opportunities, and then we'll talk. Steve Wallace will give an overview, a presentation about his experience attending and presenting at the International Symposium back in July. Again, always like to give an overview, partly for myself to see where we are and how far we've come. So here we are now toward the end of August. I know that we may have some colleagues at the Australasian Simulation Congress, which is happening in Adelaide this week. In September, Russ McMullen will give a talk about some recently published, so far as is reasonably practicable guidance from the New Zealand National Rail Industry Advisory Forum. We are planning a meetup and a social event, I think, in the months of October and November. And we'll probably have one meetup and one social event spread across the October, November, December kind of timeframe. Just as a reminder, we're always looking for suggestions for topics. We've had a couple of people reach out in the past and say, hey, could I present on? And the answer is probably yes. So if you're interested in showcasing an achievement, talking about something that you and or your company have done, we're happy to entertain unsolicited proposals for presentation spots. Wanted to make this is a new a new slide to our rotating sort of general chapter business agenda. Yasmin, I think it's Mujenovic, I butchered it already, is a systems engineer actually based out of Adelaide, South Australia. Yasmin is our chapter's most recently minted CSEP, having achieved his CSEP accreditation in early this month. He's got a background of that many of us have in engineering, especially electrical engineering, and was exposed to systems engineering in an on the job kind of way. He picked up after working with some of the big defense contractors who live and breathe the discipline. I think he was encouraged to pursue CSEP. He said he found the exam to be challenging online, in particular because squeezing the entirety of the systems engineering handbook into 100 questions online is that's a lot of material to cover and not a lot of questions, not a lot of space to cover it in. He also found the CSEP application process, the actual paperwork, straightforward, in part because he's a registered professional engineer, and much of the material that he used for that, he was able to repurpose for his CSEP accreditation. So congrats to Yasmin. The pin is in the mail. I've got a tracking number ready to go. I did also want to spotlight, for anybody who's watching this video after the fact is probably not going to get this in time, but there is an in-person systems engineering training opportunity. So Becca Applied Technologies has organized some training with Capability Associates. Dr. Mike Ryan will be coming to present at Becca House on Pitt Street in Auckland at the end of September. There's the dates, there's the price. You'll note that that's actually a discount from the list price. Lunch is available. Our lunch will be provided. Only 3 seats are available. If you're interested, please get in touch. Would be really happy to have these seats taken up. And I think that these are 3 seats specifically for INCOSE New Zealand members. Or participants in the New Zealand or in the INCOSE New Zealand systems engineering community. So if you know anybody who might be interested in this, give them a hand, share this information with them, and get in touch so that we can, I've sat in on this course delivered by Ian Falconbridge, and it's really good. It's really good. Great refresher if you're somewhat experienced. This is the advanced course. An excellent introduction to both the top level as well as some of the nitty-gritty details. So 10 of 10 would recommend. Hope to see some friendly faces there too. I also wanted to spotlight some of the maybe lesser known INCOSE resources that are available. There's a primer on complexity. Complexity is something that I've been hearing about and talking about quite a bit more in the last year or so. And in particular, complexity as something that can be managed through the application of systems engineering principles. So there's a white paper. It's not very long, released in 2021. Available free for download. You don't need to be a member. There's the download link, but it actually includes a description of what complexity is and how we can identify it when we encounter it, as well as a couple of approaches for addressing it, both how you address it considering the environment, the problem, and the solution, and also selecting tools and techniques for managing it. And if I'm stealing your thunder, Steve, sorry, not sorry. In the International Symposium 2024 has been announced, and it'll be held in Dublin, Ireland in July. As we were talking about before the recording started, the best way to get an invite to attend is to submit a paper, and I'd love to see and support as many New Zealand systems engineering practitioners to engage with the international community through the International Symposium as we can. So stay tuned for more. And if you do end up submitting either for the International Symposium or the International Workshop, which will be held, I think, in January 2024, let us know. We want to celebrate your achievements and make a big deal about the cool stuff that you do. Select updates from the Asia Oceania sector. I attended the sector meeting earlier. Oh gosh, maybe it was last week. It was last week. The Asia Oceania sector is looking at bidding for IS 2026 to be held in our sector. I think the Korean chapter has expressed an interest. Excuse me. And so there's no reason. I'm hopeful that we'll be selected, as they like to rotate it around the world. I think it would be really cool to have some Asia Oceania, a really substantial Asia Oceania presence at this particular forum. Some chapter updates. Korea is the Korean chapter reported that they're looking at getting an academic equivalence established in the country, which is really cool. Means that if you complete a set of like a university qualification, then you can apply directly for CSEP upon completion of that, or ASEP or CSEP upon completion of that credential. There's potentially a new chapter getting underway in Vietnam. There's been some discussion and an interest expressed from folks in that geography. Thailand has a startup chapter that's gaining momentum, and it's been really cool to see Vorachet get spearhead the efforts of the chapter and really make a splash on the sector scene. I got to brag about how we have 9 of 49 members being accredited systems engineering professionals, which as a per capita sort of thing probably puts us, I think, at the top of the roster. And I'm hopeful that our sector mates will also collect and share some of this information, in the spirit of friendly competition. But I think that that's what, about almost 20% of our members are accredited systems engineering professionals, and that's awesome. We've also made contact with somebody, a point of contact in CISA, who was part of the team that helped get systems engineering professional CSEP accreditation in Australia to be recognized or reciprocated as a chartered engineering status under Engineers Australia, which is something that we in the New Zealand chapter have also been quite interested in trying to pursue and understand. So that's the end of my pitch. That's the end of my brief. I've got the pleasure of introducing Steve Wallace, who's going to, from Shoal Group, who will be sharing his experience with the International Symposium 2023. So Steve, if I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'll give you a minute to start sharing.
Great. All right. Hopefully screen 2. Hopefully you can see.
Looks great.
Okay, great. Can you see like the bar at the top as well, or is that not the
No, I think that's invisible for, I think that's invisible for us.
the joy of technology? Great. Thanks, Jess. This is going to be quite a an intimate presentation, really. I think we all know each other, but like you said, Jess, it's at least it's up for in YouTube later on for people who wanna look at it later on. So I think, Steve, this is probably for your benefit only. I don't think we've had the chance to meet, but yeah, I'm Steve Wallace. I'm the program lead for transport and infrastructure for Shoal Group. They're an Australian-based systems engineering consultancy with presence across Australia and New Zealand. So yeah, good to meet you, Steve, and good to see everyone else.
Thank you.
So I know the first question that you're asking is, well, you went to Hawaii. Where's your tan? This is a tan for a Scotsman, so I'm quite proud of the color I've got. So don't judge me. It takes 2 weeks to defrost anyway. So yeah, this is the best you get from me. But it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge the fact that I was fortunate enough to actually go to this conference predominantly because of the paper that got accepted on understanding interface criticality in large infrastructure projects that was co-written by James Donovan, who used to be in Shoal, and also John, who's on the call from WSP. So I just want to acknowledge and thank their efforts in both the paper and the presentation as well. So quite a few things to cover over the next kind of 30 or so minutes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of run us through these kind of 5 main points. First of all, is just a quick overview, and then run through the keynotes as well. So there's 3 keynote presentations that were given on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday morning. I'll then run through the workshops that were done over the weekend, and just a bit more detail about the 2 that I attended on the Saturday and Sunday. Then an overview of the presentations. I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail about a specific presentation as a whole. It's more just about the, I guess, the general theme of the presentations that were actually there as part of the conference. And then finally, just an overview of just the Asia Oceania meeting as well that I was invited to. All right, so an overview itself, it was hosted in Honolulu in the Hawaii Convention Center on the 15th to the 20th of July. And it was actually quite a good turnout. There was 700 people in person, and also it was a hybrid event. And so there was actually 300 people online as well. So a good around 1,000 people that were attending in that hybrid event. There was a fantastic global presence. As you could imagine, with it being in Hawaii, predominantly most people were from the US, but as you could probably expect, there was a great representation from Japan, UK, Australia, and Germany. I think Australia just about pipped Germany as the second most kind of represented. So you can imagine the cheers in the crowd when that was announced. But actually, what I found great was the fact that there was attendees from a whole bunch of other countries. So just small kind of sample, Turkey, Brazil, Lithuania, Afghanistan, and there was even a representation from Mongolia as well. And in terms of the sectors, the typical sectors were represented, as you could imagine. So yeah, good representation across defense, aerospace, space, and transport. And there was a really good academic representation as well. And so the photos on the right hand side, I wish I say I took. I didn't. I shamelessly pilfered them from another presentation. They had a professional photographer there. So if you do look at those photos and think that I can do that, please don't call me. I will do nothing but disappoint you. All right, so on to the keynotes. So I'll start with Mondays, and that was done by a chap called Matthew Kamakani Lynch. So he's the founding board member of the Hawaii Green Growth Local 2030 Hub, and he's a former director of sustainability initiatives for the University of Hawaii. He currently serves as a teaching faculty member in Harvard's Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership Program. And his presentation was all about cultivating emergence for transformative change. And so he started off by providing an overview of some of the environmental challenges that Hawaii is faced and is currently facing, which we can't hide is being impacted by human activity. And so sadly, Hawaii has been described as the extinction capital of the world, and noted the akiki, which is the bird in the top right-hand side there. And there's only 5 individuals left in the world of that bird, and we're set to lose this species by the end of the year. And also this, I guess this wind map or the storm map, which was taken in August 2014, shows Typhoon Halong, Super Typhoon Genevieve, Hurricane Iselle, and Hurricane Julio. And basically, this is the first time that 4 storms of that intensity are recorded spinning in the Pacific Ocean at the same time. And no doubt, if he would have been discussing the pretty harrowing situation that's happening in Maui at the minute, if the conference happened a few weeks later on. So in 2009, Johan Rockström led a group of 28 internationally renowned scientists to identify the 9 processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. And then an update of this framework was actually conducted in 2013, which stated that society's activities have pushed climate change, biodiversity loss, shifts in nutrient cycles, and land use beyond the boundaries into an unprecedented territory. And this, in Matthew's mind, is being driven by the myth of a limitless economic growth, which essentially is a system that's been developed by us, that's having a huge impact on the world around us. And this has resulted in us even having to create new words to describe the impact on our impact on the world around us. And this led him to talk through emergence. Essentially, nothing is linear within nature. Nature changes through emergence. And he referenced Adrienne Marie Brown, who's the author of Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, on saying that emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. So it goes back to a point that he kind of constantly iterated, is the fact that this, I guess, our relationship is fractal. So the emergent properties of the whole is a mirror of the parts. So the health of the cell is the health of the species, which is the health of the planet. And so the impact of us on the Earth is creating these emergent behaviors. And so what eco-social system do we need to actually create to respond to this? And that led us on to, I guess, kind of how we change from old systems to new systems, either through choice or through necessity, and the actual actors that play a part in that change. And so the changing from the old system to the new system, this could be going from an old technology to a new technology, organizational structure, civilization itself. And so the first actor itself is a trailblazer, which is right in the middle of the screen there. And they're the actors that react quickest and start to make small changes due to the changes around them to actually understand, well, what does this mean? What are the pros? What are the cons? There's then the protector, who are embedded within the old system and have direct access to information and resources. So they can see that not all is well with the old system and are able to recognize the value in the small changes that the trailblazers are actually making, and actually support them in actually continuing that and seeing kind of what success can be made out of those small changes. There's also the hospice worker, which is a bit of a strange name for, I guess, an actor, but I guess we can almost kind of think of that as like an aid agency to alleviate the pain and suffering to the parts of the system that are actually unable to adapt and transform into that new system. And then finally, the illuminators, which are essentially the storytellers. And so he referenced a quote that, if you want to build a ship, don't find people, educate them on shipbuilding, divide up the work. You teach them to yearn for the sea. And so that's what you need an illuminator to be. You need them to have this, they have this unique ability to basically move parts and capture imaginations on what this new system can actually mean to people to get them excited about it. So this all kind of boils down to the fact that we need to shift from the old system of thinking that we rule the world to realizing that we're just one small part of a much larger whole. And if actually we changed that kind of global paradigm to recognizing this, that we're just one small part of a complex and interconnected series of systems, would that change our decisions, our technologies, our social structures, our governance, our identity, and even our definition of success? And so he just acknowledged the fact that we're all in transformative times, and the world needs the rigor of systems engineering in these times to support it. You know, we need the collaboration and discomfort of unlikely partnerships. The discomfort side of things, I thought, was an interesting kind of thought, really. The fact that, you know, we can't just be stuck in what we're used to and what we're comfortable. We have to look out and think outside of what we consider a box, and be uncomfortable with some conversations and try and find a middle ground. And also, you know, we're not separate and apart from Earth. So what can we do as a community, and also as individuals to regain balance with nature? So that was workshop one. I think it was very apt, obviously, with what's going on with Maui, and obviously very, very well delivered. The second talk on Tuesday was delivered by Sir Julian Young, which I was quite excited about. Sir Julian is the immediate past president of the UK's Institution of Engineering and Technology. He spent 40 years in the Royal Air Force and retired as a 3-star Air Marshal. So his last military appointment, he was the Director General within the for Air within the Defence Equipment and Support Organisation within the Ministry of Defence for the UK. So within that role, he led over 2,000 military and civilian specialists, and was responsible for a budget of £3.7 billion annually on equipping and supporting all of the MOD's aircraft. So the photo on the right-hand side there is just a snapshot of some of the aircraft he was chief engineer for and brought into service. So, you know, we've got the A400M, the P8, F-35, the Typhoon, basically all of the iconic aircraft from the UK for the last kind of 2 decades or even longer. But he noted that even though this is the technology that people see, it was always about the people. You know, regardless of the technology that you're working on, we're in a team sport. And so he kind of went on to saying that he had 3 roles really as a chief engineer, and being a chief engineer within a very heavily regulated environment. His first obviously was being a professional engineer, and the main role as a professional engineer really was supporting the operational commanders on the airworthiness of the systems that they were operating. He noted that the easiest thing to do is to stop something from being airborne. The harder thing to do is actually understand what needs to be done and what evidence needs to be presented to make it airborne again. So on top of being a chief engineer, he was also a project manager. He did acknowledge that systems engineering was a challenge of his in terms of learning. He never considers himself a systems engineer. He's always struggled with the concepts. He's always valued their input, but never was one himself, but acknowledges the Venn diagram and the crossover between systems engineering and project management, but also the differences between the two as well. And on top of those 2 roles, he was also a leader. And so his talks really just around his reflections throughout his career and what worked well and what he probably would have done differently if he could do it all again. So this is his kind of what worked and what to do differently list. The first what worked kind of sounds a little bit obvious, he noted, and I agree, but being good at your job, that does always help. But I think what he meant by that was the fact that, you know, like you can step off the escalator when things get tough at any point. You can just walk away and say, like, this is it, I'm done. But it's impossible to get back on whenever you do that. So sometimes you just need to kind of grit your teeth and dig in. But he did note that sometimes you can emulate being good at your job by just working really, really long hours. And it's trying to find that balance of actually doing the right thing and actually just spending a lot of time just working to try and emulate that success. His next thing about being good at his job or being good at your job is about reading the rules and really, really understanding those rules. The rules, especially around safety. So he noted that the rules are usually there, especially around safety, because something's happened in the past. I cringed a little bit at this. I don't know if you feel the same, but he did note that, like, if you understand the rules really, really well, you can work right up to the lines, and in exceptional circumstances, sometimes beyond them. I guess in design space, that kind of gives me the shivers, right? Like that's a bit of a difficult statement to wrap my head around. But I guess in an operational space, when you've got many other things going on as well, I can understand that sometimes you need to balance out, you know, what's more dangerous and what's more important to do. And his final one about being good at your job is around always driving for success. It's about taking responsibility and acknowledging that life is competitive. You know, you're either competing for a job, or even when you're in a job, you're competing with other people for resources, for time, for budget. And so just take on that responsibility and keep on driving what you think is right, and getting the resources to enable you to see it through. The second one is around making change stick. And that's around basically kind of continually improving and being restless and learning those lessons through experience. So he said on top of that, you know, apart from just trying to do it all yourself, it's about, you know, using proven models such as John Cotter's 8 steps to successful change, which I think making change stick actually is one of them. And around making change stick, the easiest way to do that is actually making the change at the highest level that you possibly can within policy. The higher you make the change, the more difficult it is for the person that's going to replace you in changing it back. So yeah, aim high when you want to make those changes. And finally, it's around continually refreshing education. You know, one slug of education at the start of your career will likely not be enough, especially around technology and the speed that technology is changing these days. You need to keep up with that. And if you do want to climb, I guess, the ranks within an organization, some actual serious education around business acumen and project management is needed. Around what to do differently, people always said that he worked too hard. And he did ask us to look in the mirror as well, if that's some feedback that we would get, which no doubt some of us do have. So take some time for fun whenever you can. And also consider a non-mainstream role. He acknowledged that he's always been an engineer. And so, you know, potentially that was a too narrow a use of, I guess, the breadth of engineering skills that you can, that you actually kind of build up along the way. And so could you utilize your engineering skills in another branch? You know, could you go into potentially policy work or something else? But with that, always remember your career anchor and return and protect it. And let's get people back from, I guess, other professions. I guess it's well known that a lot of people do engineering degrees and then leave and never actually go into an engineering job. So how do we actually protect the profession that we're part of and get more people excited and become part of that community? And finally, don't pretend to be someone else. Either stick to what you do best or consciously push yourself to adapt, but do it openly. Also to use softer skills to influence outcome. So, you know, practice mentoring over transactional leadership. And his acknowledgement that, you know, we tend to be introverts as engineers, but we kind of need to talk to people if we want to influence people and make change. Which is a difficult thing for a lot of us, I know. So yeah, be comfortable in our own skin as well. Again, is that going back to don't try and be something you're not. You know, fortunately, I think most of us are living in a pretty enlightened world compared to the past and compared to potentially other places in the world as well. And so, you know, this world does now encourage you to, you know, it encourages diversity, it encourages inclusion like never before. And so, you know, being yourself is never been more encouraged. And he kind of finished on a bit of a, I wouldn't say a downer, but I guess just a highlight of some of the challenges that the engineering world is facing, where the UK specifically, there's a shortfall of between 37 and 59,000 engineers in meeting the annual core for meeting level 3+ skills. And so with that, you know, he feels like his responsibility whenever he goes into a role is trying to find his replacement. You know, find their person that will replace you, grow them, and hope that they'll do a better job than you. But don't just grow one person, grow at least 3. and at least one person outside of your direct chain of command to try and grow that, because you never know what's going to happen with those people. Some might move on, some might retire. One of them might actually take on your role when you do move on. So he kind of left on that point, and but just to grow and inspire, I guess, the engineers of tomorrow. But if you can't do it, if you feel like you're too old, potentially support the people who are doing it. And this kind of left him down to the, I guess, the Wonder Woman and Superman methodology, where essentially the truth about Wonder Woman and Superman is that most of the time people didn't know that they were Wonder Woman or Superman, but when the opportunities came up, they just stepped up and saved the world. So his, I guess, view on doing that in the engineering space is to continue to be restless, continue to improve something every day, continue to deliver great solutions. With great delivery comes trust. With trust comes inclusion into meetings and conversations that enable you to be part of the change that you're looking to make. Don't be downhearted or about misled or misplaced recognition, and be confident that engineers will realize the benefits of a digital future, and even more boldly, that engineers will deliver a sustainable future and fix the planet. And finally, be overtly modest and inwardly proud, and you can be Wonder Woman and you can be Superman. And he did present with a pretty colorful Hawaiian shirt for most of that presentation, but right at the end, he did whip that off to show a pretty spectacular Superman kind of Under Armour thing going on there. So I had to take a snapshot of that and show you. I thought it was a pretty good finish. All right, the final keynote was from Rahul Basol, who's the managing director and global lead for visualization and interaction science AI strategy for Accenture. So his prior role, he was an associate professor in the College of Computing at Georgia Institute of Tech and a visiting faculty at Stanford University. And he's also named in Stanford's 2021 global list of top 2% of scientists. And he's a PhD in industrial and systems engineering as well. So the purpose of Rahul's talk really was to convince us that visualization is an essential skill for us all to shape the future. And it's a bit of a call to action to leverage visualizations to explore, communicate, and explain data insights, and to persuade stakeholders and to be transparent, but finally to do good. So we started the talk by, I guess, acknowledging that throughout history, humans, we've made great efforts to understand and measure the world, and technologies have advanced our understanding of the world from the very small to the very distant. But we still have a lot of work to do to describe, analyze, and communicate complex systems. But the world that we're in now, we're generating exponential amounts of data. We're going to have 100 zettabytes of data by the end of the year, and 1 zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. And so with that data, we have the opportunity to do something. And so now we're kind of, I guess, living in this algorithmic and AI era where basically every decision that we are part of is almost driven and supported by some sort of algorithm. And these algorithms are starting to use AI to improve this decision support. And with this increased data, we're also dealing with increased complexity everywhere, like even through like supply chains, economic trade, organizational systems everywhere. And so with this increased complexity, we need to augment human intelligence to increase the capability of a human to comprehend complex situations, situated to their specific needs, and to drive resolving actions from it. And Rahul's view is that human vision is the best way to actually augment human intelligence. It's the highest bandwidth sense, it's fast, it's parallel, it extends memory, and a lot of people, if not most, think visually. So he led us on to a bit of an example or an exercise here about kind of counting how many threes we see within this this image. I won't pain you. I won't ask you to do that. But what he actually ended up doing was showing how simple it was to actually make the task so much easier by just changing the contrast of the same image and supporting the user and of the data to actually kind of get to the conclusion that you want them to get to. But if there is anyone who's unbelievably eagle-eyed that's looking at this, you may see that there's actually an extra 3 that hasn't been highlighted. And so he used this visualization to emphasize that, you can use visualization to make people believe that that's all that's there, which is dangerous. Because if you have, everyone has a bias, but if you have, I guess, too much of a bias with what you're trying to show people, you're misleading them. And so we need to be true to the data, and we need to be true to what we're trying to show and not mislead the audience that we're presenting to. He also led us on to the fact that relying on data summaries like means, variance, and correlations can be quite dangerous, because you can look at it at a table and think, oh, that looks all pretty similar, but actually very, very small changes can create vastly different patterns. And so he just showed here that there's a bit of a circle, which actually with very, very small variances can lead to just a couple of lines with what is seemingly the same data. Or we could even go to something extreme as, I think he called it the datasaurus in the talk as well. And so that led us to show, it led us to kind of down the track of acknowledging that good visualization is human-centric, and actually the more you can enable them to interact with the data, the better. And he took us through a whole bunch of visualizations as well, and acknowledging, every single visualization has a pro and a con. Wind maps, there's like the cholera dot map, which is a quite a famous one back in, I think, the 1800s, about, showing kind of why people are getting cholera in London. Economic market caps, and also the London tube map. He also kind of provided an overview of scrolly telling, which I've never heard of, but I've definitely used in, and I'm sure everyone else has here as well. It's really popular in journalism when you're on the same page and you're just scrolling through an article, and graphs are popping up and changing as you go, and there's like annotations and all of that sort of stuff, which is turning into a pretty popular way of presenting data in a way that you want it to be presented without it actually being too interactive. There's also bad visualization. So this is an example of a new healthcare system. Maybe the point was to prove that how complex it was, and the fact that, again, visualizations are all about making a point and having a story to tell. So potentially someone was just pretty wound up about how many lines they have to talk to, and just wanted to prove that within this diagram. But I did find it quite ironic that patients are probably one of the furthest points from the center, and I think doctors or the physicians are the furthest bottom left as well. So whoever's thinking about this system isn't really thinking about a patient-centric system from this visualization anyway. And then finally, he just kind of took us through this graph, which essentially on the x-axis, it takes us through from static visualizations on the left and interactive visualizations on the right, and on the Y, exploratory at the bottom, and then explanatory or persuasive at the top. He is getting a bit wound up the fact that whenever people think of him as the AI visualization guy, they think of him as the dashboards guy, and there's a lot more to it than that. Dashboards are great, but fundamentally the majority of them are static. Some of them are a little bit interactive, but fundamentally the interactions are about filtering data as opposed to actually really exploring it. And so we do go into that exploratory space, but not too much. He did say we need to avoid the bottom left as much as we possibly can. There's nothing worse than a static exploratory diagram, basically saying, I've given you something, go and find something in it, without helping the user along the way. And so I guess he finalized at the point that the visualization is usually used retrospectively. But what's exciting now with all of the data and all of the technology that we've got is we're starting to see visualization being used for what if scenarios to see what can happen in the future, which is a great place to be, which is kind of where we are with this kind of green big bar here. The what if scenario modeling is in the interactive and exploratory phase, and then interactive articles, again, explanatory and persuasive, like that scrolly telling, is kind of up in that top right. So we can start to see a lot more interactive kind of visualizations kind of coming out in the future. All right, that was all of the keynotes. So actually into the conference now with the 15 minutes that we've got we've got left. So I'll kick off with the workshops. So this is just all of the workshops that were conducted on Saturday and Sunday. I won't go through each of them individually. I'll keep the kind of the screen up with just a bit of a shading so you can see what it is. But I wanted to show it, I guess, the breadth of the different workshops that people could attend on the Saturday and the Sunday. But actually, I attended these two, the practical systems engineering on the Saturday and the systems safety engineering on the Sunday. So the practical systems engineering, that was conducted by David Long, who was the previous INCOSE president, I think 2014, 2015, something like that. And the tutorial was all about demonstrating a practical approach to foundational principles and methods of systems engineering within a framework for overall project success. So it was all about kind of understanding the problem and then defining the solution as we address the requirements, the behavior, the architecture, and the V&V. And rather than treating kind of all of those steps in isolation, it's about kind of basically having a systems engineering framework suitable for the development tasks across the complexity spectrum. So he actually went quite heavily into model-based systems engineering, which is quite a theme that I've seen within the whole symposium, where I'll probably touch on it a little bit later, but fundamentally, there's a lot of people now going, why are we still calling it MBSE? Surely it's just systems engineering. So why is this model-based thing still this kind of newfound kind of approach, right? We've been doing it for 20 years. Like, it works. So let's just call it kind of SE. He also kind of highlighted an interesting point around digital threads as well. I think as systems engineers, we're quite comfortable, obviously, in the traceability of, going from, high level concepts and then, kind of breaking down, going into system requirements, allocating them to assets, doing, the supporting the design, verification of delivered system, right? And having that traceability all the way through the V. But actually the digital thread aspect is being able to continue that traceability all the way into operations and potentially even into retirement as well, to actually understand the genesis of absolutely every single asset and every single function that your operational system is conducting and is part of. And then also system safety engineering. So this was delivered by Duncan Kemp, who is from the UK Ministry of Defence, and also Megan O'Neill from System Design and Strategy Limited, based in Bristol in the UK. And so it gave an overview of modern system safety engineering. It included, providing like an overview of system or safety engineering basics, including kind of what constitutes acceptably safe in different industries and in different countries. It also gave us an overview of different approaches to engineer safe systems. It actually kind of touched on the point once again of emergence and also coupling and unintended consequences. And I guess the trade-off between high performance, high coupling systems, but very, very sensitive to emergent decisions and emergent kind of inputs, compared to, I guess, less coupled and therefore less high performing systems, but a lot more able and less susceptible to fail in emergent kind of situations. What I found really interesting is he spent a lot of time talking around kind of, I guess, organizational safety in models and mental models. And actually, it's about convincing people about safety and actually having an organizational attitude to it, as opposed to just, this is, EN 50126, follow the bouncing ball, which kind of led us into kind of like safety culture, leadership styles. And then that kind of went into a bit more of a, I guess, a complex or a bit more of a technical tutorial on STAMP, which is the System Theoretic Accident Model and Processes, which then included CAST, which is this causal analysis based on STAMP, and also STPA, which is Systems Theoretic Process Analysis. And there's a really interesting, I guess, example at a bit of a workshop on STPA and using STPA within insulin pumps, automatic insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and actually how you use STPA to understand, well, actually kind of what is a safe mode and what is not. I found it very, very similar to a lot of, I guess, control system theory that I've seen in the past. I'd love to see it being applied to, I guess, to non-control systems and seeing how it works. But being honest, I wasn't 100% convinced of its value outside of something as kind of feedbacky as an automatic insealant pump. What was really good though about this tutorial is the fact that they were trying to, I guess, base everything that they did within reality. And so they kept on going back to the 737 MAX aircraft, which, as we can all appreciate, is a very real situation when safety doesn't go well. And so actually kind of having all of these theories and not just a technical, well, this is the widget that went wrong, but actually what was the cultural kind of aspects of this? What was the organizational aspects? Why did they make those decisions? Why was this getting pushed? It was actually a really interesting conversation to have around, safety and how things can be, how things can go wrong. All right, into presentations now. I appreciate now I've gone 2 days into the conference and I've got, I think, 10 minutes left, but you'll be lucky to know I'm not going to go through all presentations. It's just a very, very high level overview of what these presentations are. So the majority of them happened between Monday and Wednesday, and it was roughly 3 sessions per day, up to 3 presentations per session, and up to 7 tracks per day in parallel as well. So there was roughly 150 presentations over the 3 to 4 days, which is significant. So yeah, obviously only could only attend roughly a seventh of every single presentation. But as you can see on the right-hand side, the topics themselves were incredibly broad. Some hopefully aren't too much of a shock. Maybe other ones are a little bit more interesting to think about as part of a systems engineering conference. But the largest number of papers and presentations were categorized in the MBSE area. Kind of a lot covered SysML, and also a lot of discussions that are going to like the Unified Architecture Framework, UAF. And as I mentioned before, there was a lot of discussion that as a community, should we just stop calling it model-based systems engineering and just call it systems engineering and concentrate on that SE component of the digital engineering environment. And once again, that's to support that kind of digital thread aspect if people are actually starting to see value in it in these very, very long, very, very complex programs throughout its life. Another interesting talk was from Mark Sampson, who is based in Siemens in Texas. And he gave a presentation on the INCOSE MBSE maturity matrix and how it's being used to assess company practices. If you have a chance to speak to Mark, I highly recommend it. He's a very candid, very smart person. And I think he says if you give him an hour with your organization, he'll be able to tell you how mature your application of systems engineering and MBSE is pretty accurately. But he did highlight that as the number of system interfaces continues to rise, the need for digital support becomes more pressing. And to highlight that, he did mention the Boeing 787, with it having something in the region of 1.2 million interactions based on the number of identified interfaces. But how, I guess, the MBSE maturity of the organizations that were supporting that, the power of that model meant that Boeing have been able to identify orders of magnitude of potential issues in the design compared to the build and integration where they're usually found. I've already covered on digital threads, so I won't bat on about that too much. But what was interesting is vendors, probably not surprisingly, are starting to see this as a potentially interesting thing to support, and so they're starting to adapt actually to ensure that tools can talk together without the need to buy all tools from the same vendor. I mean, it's hard enough trying to have an individual vendor across a project lifecycle. I mean, across a system lifecycle and being tied to one vendor. Obviously, it's a significant amount of risk to the project teams and the operational teams. And so there was actually quite a lot of talk around OSLC, which is Open Services for Lifecycle Collaboration. And I think that's actually now a standard and appears like quite a robust method for communication between different tools across the life cycle. was quite a few references made to the INCOSE Systems Engineering Competency Assessment Guide. And Lori Zipes from the US Navy NAVSEA team, she actually presented a paper on the findings from her work to improve SE competency and capability within her organization. I guess the most interesting part of that was noting that she noted like a resistance of certain parts of the organization and actually how this was overcome. And she said it was overcome by needing to keep, I guess, what she calls the heat of systems engineering at the right level to ensure that there's still a good level of enthusiasm and adoption of SE, but to prevent, I guess, pushback, which she calls an organizationally immune response. You know, if you push too hard, you get the white blood cells who don't want to change, and they come and attack the new ideas until it's no longer considered viable. It was interesting, though, that there was no real definition or measurement of SE roles and competencies within that organization before this effort commenced, despite systems engineering being a pretty critical function within that organization. And finally, I think safety cases was the most interesting thing for me personally. There was a lot of talks on how do you actually conduct safety cases with increasingly complex and non-deterministic systems. There's a really good case study on truck platooning. So basically using driverless trucks on roads. And if you have enough of these driverless trucks, can we get them to drive so closely behind each other and actually platoon them that enables, I guess, a significant drop in wind resistance and therefore a significant increase in fuel efficiency. And obviously there's a massive challenge on the economic aspects of that. If there's one truck who's owned by one company in the front, you know, everyone wants to be behind, right? So how do you manage that? But that can get sorted out. But actually the safety case of having, you know, a driverless truck that is that far behind the one in front, and how do you actually prove or provide evidence that that is, you know, SFARP is a very, very interesting challenge to work through. All right, and I just want to finish on the Asia Oceania sector meeting as well, which was led by Serge. So I've only got two quick slides on this one. So first of all, it was just an acknowledgement that it's great to see members rising and rising quite steadily, which is fantastic. But as a whole, we have 13% of INCOSE membership, but represents 60% of the global population. So there's more to be done in that space. I think, like you, Jess, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to stick to jab under the ribs and highlight that, you know, New Zealand has a pretty high per capita membership. So if the rest of the team just caught up, then we'll be doing okay. And then finally, this is just a bit of a capture of the round table during that meeting as well. I won't go through each one individually, but just a couple that I think are interesting to this group. The first one really is around that the chapter get together to share and combine initiatives. Obviously, we have these sorts of talks, which is fantastic between, you know, INCOSE New Zealand. Is there an opportunity to potentially do this in a broader level? You know, we can, I don't know, we can potentially ask another sector to come and present something, or we can go to theirs and you know, and actually share information that way. The fourth one down as well, I think is quite an interesting one, the kind of the award or excellency recognition. I think that would be a really good program to have within the sector, as long as it's an easy to apply process and people aren't scared off by the pain of actually going through it. I mean, I know, Jess, we have a fantastic medal system that you sent through, which is working really well. So I think it's probably just expanding that. And I just want to, I guess, finish on the bottom point where I can't remember who mentioned it, but someone mentioned that they were doing systems engineering for 15 years and weren't aware of all that INCOSE provides. I genuinely feel like this is changing, but I feel like the INCOSE of old had this almost era of, well, it's just a whole bunch of people in robes and hoods in a dark room, around a fire, and it didn't really seem that kind of interactive, that open. I genuinely think that's changing now. I think the way that the new INCOSE and the new leaders and the new communicators within INCOSE is, as a global organization, is really trying to open up and show what we're doing here and how we can collaborate a lot more. But the fact that people are still saying that means that there's still a long way to go. That is everything that I've got, acknowledging that I've almost gone right up to the wire, but happy to have a yarn about anything in there if anyone does have any questions.
I just want to say I really appreciate you pulling this together for us, Steve. I took a handful of notes of things to go look into following your talk today, and so I'm really pleased that you were able to come in and that you were able to attend, but also to bring this back.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, likewise, I've taken some notes. It was quite interesting listening. Well, obviously, you couldn't go into a lot of detail given the spread of papers. It was interesting what you shared around inspiring systems engineers and just some of the basic but good refreshers on that sort of stuff as well. So thank you, Steve.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate. Yeah, it is a whistle stop tour. So if I think the actual the timetable and the schedule is still on the website, and so if there is anything that if you look at that and you think, what, there was something there that you're interested in a bit more detail and want to have a chat about it, hopefully I would have attended it. There's a 1 in 7 chance at least, but yeah, let me know. You never know.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, Steve, you retained so much.
I know.
What's that, mate?
You retained so much in-depth information from what you went and saw. Impressive.
All good. I blame the beer.
Well, given that you've got to go in just a minute or two, I'm gonna just pop up, take over the screen share. Let me know if that's up.
Yep.
Cool. That's not what Russ is going to talk about. Russ isn't going to talk about the International Symposium 2023. That was a copy paste error. On the 26th of September, Russ McMullen of City Rail Link will talk about recent guidance on so far as is reasonably practicable as applied in the New Zealand rail context, which we'll do a correct registration link this time with the right date and time popped in. Sorry, copy paste errors. But yeah, this is what we've got for you this month. Thank you very much for those of you that attended, and cheers to those who are watching online after the fact. If you've got any questions about this presentation or about INCOSE New Zealand, if you've got ideas for a talk in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always open for topic ideas, even if it's not you. If you've got a suggestion for something that somebody else can present, always keen to hear more. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'll stop recording and bid everyone good night.
Thanks very much.